Hey guys, welcome to my webinar. So this is Beating Chronic Fatigue Syndrome. It's a full in-depth immersion into understanding chronic fatigue syndrome, understanding the mechanisms behind it, integrating science and natural health, and giving you guys really some solutions to help people out there that are struggling with chronic fatigue syndrome. So I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit of information about myself. I'm a New Zealander from Wellington. My name is Corin Storkey. I basically studied an undergraduate in chemistry and biochemistry in New Zealand, and then went on to do a PhD in medicinal chemistry at the University of Melbourne, where following that I postdoced as a researcher in the Heart Research Institute in Sydney, before venturing into what I call the deep, dark world of health, the pharmaceutical industry, where I worked as a medical liaison for one of the big pharma companies in Australia. So I've had extensive background in science and chemistry and biochemistry and medicinal chemistry, including multiple publications in high impact reviewed journals, different patents and technology ownership, and also the founder and director of a company called Seleno Health, which is a specialized natural health company that helps to integrate basically the East and the West, the best of alternative and natural medicines, and bring credible scientific evidence to support it, specifically looking at chronic inflammatory conditions. So we're going to start on this journey. This is a little bit about me. I've obviously struggled with chronic fatigue myself in the past, and I'm taking you through my journey to recovery throughout this webinar. But this is really where I think we get to when it comes to health, when our health fails us, is these two different directions or routes that we can take. And as a young scientist, I believe there was really only one route, which was the Western medical route. But now, obviously, they're learning that there are alternative health solutions out there for us as well. But we reach this crossroads when our health fails, and we have two options. For most or majority of people, we tend to go see our doctor, our Western doctor, and they will look at a whole lot of tests and analysis and our symptoms, and they'll try and give us a diagnosis and give us a solution for those health problems. If they struggle to find anything, then they'll often refer us in to see different specialists, and we slowly work our way down that Western health route. Now, it's only when this Western approach fails, where we don't get solutions, or maybe we get given drug solutions, but we don't actually feel any improvement in our health, do people then often come back to where they started and start to look at alternative methods. Now, the alternative health solution pathway is complex because, as you know, there's so many articles out there on Google, there's so much information, there's so much pseudoscience, there's so much misinformation, miracle cures. We basically spend on this route 95% of our time on what I call Dr. Google, trying to find solutions to our health. Now, both sides are fraught with issues. Both sides we have a lot of arrogance in our Western health system, where our doctors believe they know everything. They often say that the issues are psychosomatic and that they're in our head. But I always say the only thing worse than an arrogant doctor who believes he knows everything is an arrogant hippie or naturopath who thinks that they know more. And this is where we have issues where both sides of this coin, we struggle sometimes to find answers, and we spend a lot of money and a lot of time, and we invest a lot of hope in all of these practitioners who we think can help us on our health journey. So I truly believe that the future of managing some of these chronic inflammatory conditions is really where we can combine East and West. We can combine, the best of what our health system can offer, and integrate that into what we can learn from people like naturopaths, medical herbalists, nutritionists, holistic therapists, but understanding that we need to have some scientific balance there as well. So let's talk about health, because this is really an interesting thing. I talk to a lot of people with chronic fatigue, and people always ask me these questions: why did I get chronic fatigue? Or they look back at their lives when they got sick, and they try and pinpoint a moment in their life in which their health collapsed. And this is always a dangerous thing to do, because I feel like when we're looking for a reason behind something like chronic fatigue, it really puts us in this position where we're too closely attentive to the detail and we're not looking at the big picture of health. So people with chronic fatigue generally follow quite sort of typical personality traits. They're often high achievers. They're perfectionists. They're very self-critical people. They're very much goal-focused and feel like the weight of the world is often on their shoulders. And this can be very detrimental to their own health because they generally, instead of putting their health, first, second, or third, it comes in around 10th, and that the happiness and health of everyone else around them is often more important in their minds. Now, I like to think of our health as being a solid tower of blocks. And this tower can resist. It can resist all sorts of stressors. But when we slowly begin to etch away at that tower, and we've all hopefully heard of the game called Jenga. So Jenga tower is a perfect analogy. We slowly start to remove pieces of that tower, one by one, one by one. And those pieces can be removed through a whole range of different stresses, of different chemical, physical, or emotional stresses. And then there becomes a time where that tower starts to slowly destabilize, and maybe we see that happening or occurring as symptoms or issues in our life or in our body, but we often ignore them or we overlook them because we're too busy focused on achieving and focusing on the things that we think we need to be doing in our life. So we put our health to the side. Eventually, though, at some point, we pull out the wrong block, and that tower comes crumbling down. And this is the game of Jenga in essence, but this is what happens with our health. So I feel as though people with chronic fatigue, they're often too focused on that one single block. I heard stories of people say, oh, I was, my health was fine, and I went on a trip to Southeast Asia and I got this parasite or this stomach bug, and I came back and I was never the same. Or, or another person said, oh, I had this concussion and it never sort of went away. Or, and there's these instances in their life where they feel like their health changed. But what I always try and reassure people is that, there's the straw that broke the camel's back, like in the case of the Jenga tower, but we really need to step back and realize how much had we destabilized that tower throughout years of neglect of our health. And when we hit that downward spiral, it is very hard to start to reassemble that tower to come back out, but it's not impossible. So we need to firstly be able to transition from attention to detail to big picture, and that's really, really important. So these kinds of personality traits that I mentioned, high achievers, perfectionists, those that are very self-critical, these are what I call Jenga pullers. So they're really good at destabilizing the Jenga tower. And this is where we're going to talk later when we talk about recovery, to do with the way in which we start to alter subconscious behaviors, because it's often a subconscious behavior that can cause this destabilization. So I'm going to take you back to the start of my journey with chronic fatigue. And I was one of these people. I was very self-critical, very goal-focused. I was a very, very high achiever, particularly with my studies at university. I think my lowest grade at the whole degree I went through was about an A or an A minus. So for me, I was in my early 20s, and the pressures were building up. My health was struggling. I thought it was just stress from university. I thought it was, basically exam stress, a bit of emotional stress, physical stress, pushing the body, doing long, late hours. But I was, in my early 20s, I thought my body was impervious to all of these issues. And then one day, I just came home and I just felt really dizzy and disorientated, and I collapsed. And from this point onwards, my health deteriorated rapidly, really rapidly. And within, 6 to 8 weeks, I was bedridden. So some of the things I remember was just extreme fatigue and malaise. If I tried to push my body in any physical way, I would go backwards, I would collapse. My immune system crashed. I've got a beautiful photo here showing you guys one of the rashes I used to get. These used to cover my whole body, and any sort of trigger inflammatory trigger would ignite these kind of full body rashes. I had shingles on and off. I had toxoplasmosis. I had every cold and flu you can imagine. My body just was unable to protect myself from any infection. I had severe muscle and joint pain. And I remember later on my GP at some point saying, you know, I think this could be fibromyalgia or some form of muscular issue. If I was trying to do any work on a computer for more than 10, 15 minutes, I would get searing pain, my muscles, my shoulders. I would lead to migraine, severe muscle atrophy. Every time that I would push my body as well, I would get these seizures where I would just start shaking and collapsing, and I would end up on the floor sort of convulsing. And you know, with a lot of that came on consistent ongoing migraines, so sometimes focal, sometimes pressure migraines, dizziness, disorientation. I think one of the worst symptoms I really remember though was the insomnia, because you go through the day and you're just so tired, and then you get to bed at night and you cannot sleep for the life of you. And I remember many nights lying awake, you know, just looking at the clock and thinking, God, I got to get to sleep. I got to get to sleep because I'm going to be wrecked, you know, for days if I can't. And I had many nights where I wouldn't sleep until, you know, 4 or 5 a.m. when the sun was coming up. But when you do sleep as well, I remember waking up and just feeling like I'd never slept at all, like completely unrefreshed. And these kinds of issues with insomnia, I think they really start to play havoc with the mental health. And this is where you start losing your mind because you're just so tired. You're not connected to your body. You can't sleep no matter how hard you try. And it's absolutely like a downward spiral from this point. So obviously, you know, these symptoms started to flare and exacerbate over time, but this was really at its worst what it looked like. And, you know, I went down that Western health route, and this is really how everything was assessed. So all my symptoms were sort of broken into different categories. And as I, you know, gave up with my GP and had to go to be referred to all these people, you know, I went to see a physiotherapist. I went to see, you know, dermatologists for all the skin issues. I had a neurologist wanting to, you know, I went to see for the migraines and the seizures. Even went to a sleep clinic to assess how and if I was sleeping. I had a psychologist I was seeing for the anxiety and the depression that went with it. My gastro, because I had, you know, blood in my stools and I was intolerant to all sorts of foods. You know, I had an immunologist because I had consistent shingles, toxo, colds, flus. So this was quite an array of specialists. I think we got 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 different people that I was seeing. The way that I was treated by each of them, so my GP was you know, the first point of call, and it was just consistent blood tests trying to find things that could show that there was something wrong with my body. Consistently being put on antivirals for you know, for the shingles, antibiotics for the colds and flus every time I would get sick, and I was just shot. I had a physio that I was sent to see, and they would give me, you know, exercises for the muscle pain and try and relieve some of that. Lots of anti-inflammatories that I would just rub all over myself all day, every day. Hot water bottles, heat packs. I was also put on oral anti-inflams, which really actually probably made things worse by upsetting my gut. My dermatologist got me on clomitrazole, which is antifungal treatment, because I was getting consistent inguinal fungal infections going on that I couldn't shake. I was put on low-dose prednisone to help with the autoimmune issues with the skin flare-ups. I finally got into seeing a neurologist, and this took almost 6 or 7 months after I had asked for the referral. And they assessed me and said, yes, you do have issues with migraine. And I said, well, I knew that, like I could have told you that. We're going to give you some Imigrin when you get your migraine attacks, which is for acute migraine issues. And then they put me on a tricyclic antidepressant, amitriptyline. And I remember when I started taking that numbed me completely. Like I felt incredibly detached at that point. My GP actually referred me to a cardiologist who was working with people with chronic fatigue, and they rapidly diagnosed me with tachycardia syndrome, which is an inability for the heart rate and blood pressure to respond to changes in elevation, and they got me on a beta blocker for that. And then I had a assessment with a psychologist after being 6 months of bedridden on a sickness benefit, and they said to me, I think you might be a little bit depressed. Which at this point I said, I think it's beyond a little bit depressed. How about suicidal for that? And so they said, well, we'll put you on some Prozac, because at first they were trying to figure out if the depression had come before the chronic fatigue, and insinuating that a lot of this was potentially in my head. And then finally, a gastro was assessing me potentially for ulcerative colitis, and they started me on a 5-ASA treatment for that and got me on omeprazole for my gastric reflux that I was having and food intolerances. So there you go. That's about a 15-month journey into Western health in total, through all those specialists and all those different drugs and treatments. And I feel as though with Western health, this is really, unfortunately, about as far as that Western health has gone with regards to chronic fatigue at this point. And there was my arsenal of drugs. So at one point I was taking about 11 different things in a day to try and deal with all of these issues. And I really feel as though, you know, the only place where Western health was useful was exclusion. So excluding all of these sort of known issues like HIV and tuberculosis and, you know, Addison's and things that we know are fatigue causing. To know that you don't have those is nice. It's nice to know I don't have diabetes, you know, it's nice to know you know. But I feel as though after that, you know, all that they do is give you the label, you know, you have chronic fatigue syndrome. And it took me almost 15 months to get that label. And I'm taking all these different drugs. And the question really is, did I feel any better? And I honestly can say, no, I didn't. I felt, if anything, I felt the same as I had when I started on the Western health journey, but I felt completely more numb to everything. I felt more depressed. I felt more hopeless. And the label itself is even incredibly frustrating, because knowing what I know now, I mean, that's such a subconscious label to give yourself chronic fatigue. It goes directly into your subconscious, and you're not meant to feel fatigued when you hear that label. So I know for some people, maybe they feel like the label is a good thing for them, and I have a reason, I have an understanding. But really, chronic fatigue syndrome, all it means is we've excluded every known condition that causes fatigue, and we don't really know what's wrong with you, but you have this fatigue issue, and your body's not happy. I prefer to avoid the use of the label, and I really like the way in which they look at health from a holistic perspective with chronic fatigue, and I'm going to talk more about this later. But you know, when we look at traditional Chinese medicine, they never would use a label like chronic fatigue. They would look at the symptoms and they would assess your health as a whole, and they would diagnose on other factors. So we're going to talk more about this later, but that was my journey into Western health. And I remember at its worst, you know, when I was sort of 6 to 8 months in, and really losing all hope for everything. It was absolutely horrendous, you know, on the body. And sometimes people say, you know, what is it like? And I think the best way to describe it, if you've never had chronic fatigue, you can't comprehend. You really can't understand. But if you've never had it, then, you know, the way to really feel what it's like is to close your eyes and to think about the time that you had that really horrific flu, you know, that came around in winter and it took out everyone in your office maybe and everyone at your school or your work. And, you know, the day or two before it really hit, you started feeling absolutely zonked. You wake up in the morning, you couldn't sleep all night because maybe you had fever, you're sweaty, you're hot, you feel like you've been hit by a bus and you're just unable to get out of bed that day. You know, you feel fevery, your joints ache, your muscles ache, your bones are aching, your head is throbbing, and you feel completely disconnected from the world. So hold on to that feeling, and remember, we know what that's like. We've all experienced that kind of flu, but it doesn't just stop there, because I think chronic fatigue has other physiological layers on there, you know, and one of the other feelings that I feel that comes with it is this feeling of underlying anxiety. So I say, remember, you know, if you're scared of heights, you know what it's like when you stand on a tall building and you look over the edge and your stomach just shrinks. Or if you're scared of public speaking, when you have to stand up in front of this audience and your heart just races and you feel so anxious. Like that sort of feeling comes with it. So add that in. So imagine when you're sick as a dog, lying in bed with all those other symptoms, and you've got that big speech coming up today, and you just feel that level of anxiety. And then compound that with extreme jet lag. So imagine in that state having to get on a plane and then fly 24 hours from one side of the world to the other. And when you get there, you've barely slept at all, if any. Suddenly there's a 12-hour time difference. And if you've ever experienced jet lag, you'll know what that feels like. Your body doesn't know if it's day or night. And you feel absolutely disconnected from yourself. So your head is up here somewhere. And then also add in the issues of what a lot of people like I got, where you've got these gastrointestinal issues going on, and your bowels are constantly up and down like a yo-yo. And that, for me, put it all in a blender. That's really how you feel. So it's not surprising when people get to this point that they become completely depressed. They have chronic anxiety, and they end up on that's those suicidal thoughts, because you feel like there's no way out. And you really, really hit rock bottom. So what I want to do from this point, like now that we can understand the journey, and I'm sure all of you out there who have experienced chronic fatigue in some way can relate to aspects of this journey. And we all have our own journeys that we've gone on. Some are still, deep in that journey themselves, and maybe that's why you're watching this webinar. But what I want to do is change shift at this point, and I want to take you on a journey into what we now know about chronic fatigue, because I feel like when I went through Western Health, they really knew nothing. And this really doesn't help your overall mental health and well-being. So I'm going to outline a few key studies, and I'm going to put together a model of what I think chronic fatigue looks like. And we're going to use that model to then look at how we can improve our health outcomes, improve our health. And I'm going to share with you my journey to recovery based on that model. So understanding the science behind chronic fatigue is integral. And I think there's been some incredible advances in this. So one study I want to allude to here is published in the Journal of Microbiome in 2016. And this was done by a group of researchers at Cornell Uni. So they, in the US. So they took healthy controls and they took people with long-standing chronic fatigue. And they ran some blood samples and stool samples on these people looking for specific biomarkers. And they were able to, using these biomarkers, diagnose chronic fatigue with an 82% certainty. So this is super definitive. If we think about my health journey, it took 15 months of exclusion to get any sort of diagnosis for chronic fatigue. So the markers they were looking at were LPS, which stands for lipopolysaccharides. And these are markers of microbial translocation. So I'm going to talk about microbial translocation in a minute. The second marker that was significantly different between healthy and non-healthy people is a marker called FABP, which is fatty acid binding protein. And this is a marker of gastrointestinal tract damage. So damage to the GI tract of your intestines. And then the last marker was CD14. And CD14 detects LPS bound to LBP. So it's basically a correlation marker that looks at these two markers to say, yes, that there's definitively something going on here. And it also can give us an indication of the immune response and the inflammatory response as a result of increased levels of LPS and FABP. So all of these correlations were positive for people with chronic fatigue. And the authors concluded that in the case of chronic fatigue, there was a significant increase in microbial translocation happening with these patients, and also significant increase in markers of chronic inflammation. So let's look at this model. What does that mean? If you're not very scientifically minded, then we can break it down bit by bit and show you. Well, to understand this, we need to understand a very important aspect of our nervous system. And our nervous system, which I've got on a slide coming up, consists, of our central nervous system of the brain, but also we have what we call the enteric nervous system of the gut. Now, in the enteric nervous system, it's not just human cells that exist there. We actually exist in harmony with a whole range of bacteria. And if we actually look at the amount of bacteria that is inside or on the outside of our body, it way outweighs the number of cells and then the amount of DNA of our body in its entirety. So we actually exist predominantly as bacteria. 85% of our entire DNA makeup is bacterial DNA. We're only 15% human. And this bacteria has come to live in symbiosis with us. And it's only over the last 10 to 15 years have we started to realize the importance of the bacteria and its role within chronic inflammation. So what are these researchers looking at? Well, they're looking for LPS to begin with. Now, LPS comes from our bacteria. And what we're seeing is really high levels of this microbiome bacteria in the blood. How does it get there? Well, the answer is it gets there from our second clue, which is increased FABP, meaning we're getting increased breakdown of the lining of our gut. And so we're getting what we call increased translocation of microbes through that gut lining. Now, the microbiome and the enteric nervous system regulate what comes in and out of the body. And in the case of people with chronic fatigue, we're seeing basically an inability to be able to effectively open and allow the right things into the blood. And this creates big problems. What we see when we get a breakdown of this gut lining and we get increased translocation, so increased permeability of the gut, we start to see bacteria flowing through that wall that shouldn't be there. And as the levels get higher, this ignites the immune system. So 80% of our immune system sits in this gut. And then the immune system has to switch on, do its thing, and destroy the bacteria or protect our body from invasion. So this kind of issue, you can understand why people with chronic fatigue have this low-lying feeling of infection. The glands are slightly swollen. You know, we have a slight fever. We're struggling all the time. The immune system is constantly at battle. And a lot of the battle is happening here in the enteric nervous system. So all of these markers were elevated. And this says to us that this gut environment is very, very permeable. Now, the modern term that we use for this in alternative or holistic health is this concept of leaky gut. The gut is leaking. And there's a lot of truth behind this. We're seeing a lot of permeation through that gut that shouldn't be there. So this is the first clue that these researchers found that was able to enhance their diagnosis of chronic fatigue. Now, the second thing they looked at was stool samples. And why on earth would they look at your stool? Why are they interested in your poop? Well, the answer is the stool tells us about the makeup of the microbiome, because that bacterial makeup will tell you about the flora and fauna basically inhabiting this area. What they found that there's no one species. So it's not like they could say, look, we have Helicobacter issues going on there. No, it was basically a complete reduced diversity across all microbes. So they did DNA count and they showed that there was significant reduction in the DNA levels of microbes in people with long-standing chronic fatigue. So this idea, we would call this concept dysbiosis, meaning an unhappy microbiome, a biome where we have, too much of one and not enough of the other. So this disbalance creates disharmony, and it's sort of chicken or the egg. Does dysbiosis lead to gut inflammation and gut permeation, or does gut permeation and inflammation lead to dysbiosis? And the answer is they both lead to each other. So this study really highlights two key things. We have leaky gut happening and we have this disbalance of gut bacteria, and this is creating some chronic inflammation that's really affecting the body. Now, they were able to use these markers to diagnose with an 82% certainty. So there's significantly something happening here in people with chronic fatigue. Now, a new study came out as well, and this was at the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences in 2017 that I think was really interesting, and it looked at cytokine signatures associated with chronic fatigue. So what does that mean? Well, cytokines basically tell us how inflamed are we, how much inflammation is happening in our body. And these were specifically pro-inflammatory cytokines. So they had a control, but then they also basically took patients with either mild, medium, or severe chronic fatigue. And they diagnosed the mild, medium, or severe based on their symptoms, how debilitating their condition currently was. And then they sampled these cytokines and they showed this perfect linear correlation. And you can see here we've got mild, medium, and severe, mild, medium, severe, always in this increasing correlation. So all of the correlation graphs tell us is that for people with chronic fatigue, the levels of inflammation will determine the severity of the symptoms. The more inflammation we have occurring, the more severe the symptoms will be throughout your body. Now, with chronic fatigue as well, we have to remember it's very non-localized. So there's no specific point where we see inflammation occurring. We have symptoms here, there, and everywhere. And we remember looking at my symptom chart, there was issues with the immune cells. There was issues with mitochondrial function of energy production. There was issues with my neurology. I was getting migraines. There were issues in my gut. So inflammation is very non-localized. If we compare chronic fatigue to other, chronic inflammatory conditions, like let's look at psoriasis, for example, we can see it occurring. We can see the inflammation flaring up in a specific part. It's very localized inflammation. But what we do know from these kinds of studies is that the levels of global inflammation will determine the severity of the symptoms. And that gives us a clue as to how we can also help combat this. Now, the last study I want to allude to, which is really interesting, was this one in Frontiers of Immunology in 2018, where they tried to understand one of the most puzzling, complex parts of chronic fatigue, which is post-exertional malaise, PEM. Now, PEM, post-exertional malaise, basically means when I exercise with chronic fatigue, I feel worse, a lot worse, and I go backwards rapidly. This doesn't happen to healthy people. This doesn't happen to even people with other types of inflammation, like diabetes, for example, where if they exercise, they can improve their condition. So they did this by tracking markers within the energy producing pathways. And the way we make energy is through carbohydrate ingestion. The carbohydrates are broken down, they go into the mitochondria, they get converted to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA goes in the Krebs cycle, and we start to make ATP, our energy currency, our energy molecule. And that ATP will go to your cells, be used by your muscles, and it provides us energy to fuel our bodies and our brains. Now, what they found in chronic fatigue is everything I've highlighted here in red, levels were massively increased, and everything in green, levels were decreased, and some pathways themselves were even blocked. So they basically showed that we're burning dirty, dirty fuel. That when we metabolize in chronic fatigue, we are not cleanly metabolizing. And one thing that's really evident here, these guys called ROS. So look on the page at ROS. Stands for reactive oxygen species. Now, reactive oxygen species are molecules that we make as a byproduct of metabolism. But in healthy people, we make levels of these species that are basically easy to contain and easy to protect from through our natural detoxification pathways. In the case of chronic fatigue, when we're metabolizing, we're making much, much higher levels of these types of species. And reactive oxygen species will contribute to inflammation in the body. And what does inflammation do? It exacerbates the symptoms. So you can see here that when we understand some of these metabolic pathways and what's going on, we know that when we push metabolism in chronic fatigue, we actually exacerbate production of reactive oxygen species, which will exacerbate inflammation, which will worsen the symptoms. And this also will go and impact back on the inflammation in the enteric nervous system and the central nervous system. So really interesting in-depth analysis. Now, the answer is chicken or the egg? Is there a defect in the pathway that creates this, or does inflammation itself create this? And I truly believe that there's no specific, it's not a genetic issue. There's potential epigenetics involved, but it basically means it's not coded in our DNA to have dysfunction of mitochondria like this. This occurs through changes in lifestyle, through environmental factors. And if it's something that occurs that way through epigenetics, because they've done identical twin studies in chronic fatigue of people with and without, and shown that it is not a genetic condition, then the good news is it's a reversible process, because it's post-translation. It's not encoded into the DNA. We can change our epigenetics. We can change the way we translate. The way that we fold proteins. So really interesting little studies. And mitochondrial dysfunction is a problem, because we're seeing a loss of production of ATP. So here's what new clinical evidence has shown. Chronic fatigue incorporates dysbiosis of the gut, leaky gut, chronic inflammation, immune dysfunction, mitochondrial dysfunction. And I'm going to talk more in a bit about adrenal fatigue and impacts on what we call the master glands, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal system. So these are all aspects of CFS that have been clinically shown to be relevant by scientific researchers around the world. I would say chronic fatigue is an inflammatory disorder, and it affects the enteric nervous system and the central nervous system, so the gut and the brain. And it really sits on the inflammatory continuum, being the most non-localized inflammatory condition. So its nearest neighbor would be fibromyalgia, where we get more specific inflammation affecting muscular tissue, rheumatism, where it's affecting our joints and joint tissue, Crohn's, ileal tissue in the intestine, colitis, colonic tissue in the colon, psoriasis, dermal tissue in the skin, alopecia, hair follicles in the head, and then even diabetes, where it's vascular inflammation. So all of these conditions are chronic inflammatory conditions with an autoimmune aspect. But the difference between was which system of cells or which system within the body is most affected. And in the case of chronic fatigue, it seems to affect more our energy production pathways. So this is how the gut and brain work and how they're connected. And I talked about this previously, but we have the microbiome, the enteric nervous system, and we have the brain, the central nervous system. They communicate via electrical signals up and down the vagus nerve. So one will impact on each other, but also they work through chemical signals. So the chemical signals that come from the brain predominantly come from the hypothalamus, the master gland, and the pituitary, the second master gland, and these two will basically create and produce all of the hormones that we make in our body to regulate our immune cells, our metabolism, our adrenal cortex. It will produce through the adrenal glands cortisol, catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and they set the body into a sympathetic state, a fight-flight state, or a parasympathetic state, a state of rest. The enteric nervous system also communicates back, so it involves the process of gut permeation, so it allows the right or wrong things into the gut. It also produces all of our neurotransmitters like serotonin. So 90% of serotonin we make is in the gut. It plays a role in intestinal absorption, so allows us to absorb the minerals and the things we need from the food. Without that bacteria there, we couldn't possibly survive. And then it plays a huge role in our immune function. So we've said 80% of our immune system sits in this environment. So it's incredibly important when we're looking at autoimmune conditions. And it talks to the brain through cytokines, through inflammatory molecules, through neurotransmitters and metabolites. So let's look at the model of chronic fatigue. This is what I call the gut to brain model. So when we look at what goes wrong, we have dysbiosis occurring initially, imbalance of good and bad bacteria. This leads to gut inflammation, which enhances the permeation of that gut, this leaky gut idea. it creates this ongoing immune reaction and response as we're getting the wrong things coming through the gut. And over time, the immune system will become dysfunctional and we'll start to see hyper and hypoactivity, so flare-ups of the overactive immune function, and then an inability to respond when required. And with this, we see an elevated stress response of signals to alert the brain that we have inflammation occurring. So things like cytokines and TNF-alpha levels will go up. And then as the brain tries to respond over time, we start to see a lack of ability to respond to the external environment, known as HPA dysregulation. So this is where the master glands can't effectively produce the hormones in the right way in the right time to manage our stresses, whether they're chemical, physical, or emotional. And finally, we start to see global inflammation occurring and a real big impact on our energy pathways and post-exertional malaise creeping in. Now, when we get HPA dysregulation occurring, this will create this elevated level of stress. And that stress, again, is an inflammation is going to hit the gut, inflame the gut, enhance the permeability, create more immune dysfunction, create dysbiosis, and we're back to where we started. So this idea of, you know, the gut to brain and then the brain to gut, we're basically deep in that downward spiral at this point. And this is why it's really hard to get out, because we're getting dysfunction of all of our systems. So I'm going to take you through the typical inflammatory model. What happens with inflammation? Well, it's really a three-step process. So the first step we call primary inflammation. Now, primary inflammation is I call it like the spark to ignite the tinder. So we have this enteric nervous system, this microbiome sitting there as the tinder, and we start sparking with inflammatory triggers. Now, these triggers can ignite inflammation, and this inflammation can propagate and create, like in this instance, the breakdown of the gut wall, permeation coming through, and then ignite the secondary inflammatory response, which is a more aggressive approach to inflammation. But in primary inflammation, the sparks are what I call primary initiators. And when we think about things that ignite inflammation in the body, there is a big list that we can come up with, and a list that's very closely related to the way in which our lifestyles have changed as we've evolved. If we look at modern person compared to, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, the stresses have massively changed. So I'm going to give you an example of some primary initiators on the next page. These types of things are what I call sparks, to spark the inflammatory process. So food and lifestyle are massive, and this has drastically changed over the last even 10 to 20 years. Massive increase in the amount of sugar we consume, the amount of salt, saturated fat. Foods that are processed are highly inflammatory and can spark inflammation. Artificial sweeteners also, there was a study in Nature that came out a few years back showing that artificial sweeteners can cause more diabetes than sugar itself because they intentionally disrupt the microbiome. People talk about the issues with fluoride, with electromagnetic fields and magnetic radiation. Gluten intolerances, the way in which we cultivate wheat has become a really big problem, with these really resistant kind of wheats that have high in gluten that seems to be intolerable for a lot of people. Insomnia is a massive part of this. If we are sleep deprived, we create inflammation through that. Stress, emotional issues, toxins, glyphosate sprays, pesticides, things that we put on our food and we consume daily. And then we look at things like antibiotic overuse. Antibiotics can wipe out a biome and make it really hard to populate the right bacteria when we're following a bout of antibiotics. And then as well, we have a whole group of pathogenic diseases. So things like Epstein-Barr virus, glandular fever are very closely related to chronic fatigue. I think I remember reading 75 to 80% of people with chronic fatigue have had glandular fever. And these kinds of viruses are very, very good at propagating inflammation and are very hard to eliminate from the body and to allow the immune system to rest. Cyclomegalovirus is another one. And I'm sure we're going to, in the future, be able to put coronavirus on there as a pro-inflammatory initiator as well. So all of these things, just because we exposed to them doesn't mean we're going to get chronic fatigue. I know some people out there that take all this kind of food and diet and lifestyle all day, every day, and they never get sick. And I put that down to this thing in the middle we call genetics. So some people are genetically more predisposed. Now, these kinds of things I would call risk factors. And if you're genetically predisposed, then these risk factors are things that you want to eliminate or avoid or reduce within your diet and lifestyle. So those kinds of inflammatory initiators are going to spark inflammation. This is going to lead to an etching away of the gut lining, and we're going to start to see an influx of bad bacteria coming through. Now, the secondary part of this process is where the immune system has to deal with that infection, in essence, which is what's happening. And what we see is these cells called macrophages, the activity of them increases, and we see them engulfing this bacteria and trying to bombard it and destroy it. Now, a lot of the activity of this occurs through this enzyme here called myeloperoxidase, or MPO. And this is an enzyme that I studied heavily in my PhD because it's very closely related to a lot of these autoimmune conditions. We were looking at its role within heart disease, but it is the enzyme that protects us, but also the enzyme that destroys us when we look at immunity. So myeloperoxidase works by taking peroxide that we produce through another enzyme, chloride ions, and making this chemical here called hypochlorite, and it's really good at doing this. So for those of you that have a bit of chemistry background, you may or may not know, but hypochlorite is bleach. And bleach is so effective at killing bacteria and viruses and things. That's why we use it to clean our toilets in our hospitals. So what we're actually doing inside of our cells, inside of our body, is we're making bleach on a micro scale. And we're doing that to kill invaders. So the macrophages will engulf the bacteria or the things coming through the wall. And then this enzyme will be switched on and we'll start pumping out bleach and killing everything in that cell. And then it will, in a healthy person, switch off. So what I've got here is a visual representation of this. On the left side, we have in the B here, this photo B. This is a beautiful little healthy colon, someone with a normal bowel. On the right-hand side, we have a very red, sore, and inflamed colon of someone with ulcerative colitis. And if you've ever spilled bleach on yourself, you'll look at the skin and you'll see how that bleach can damage your skin. It looks like psoriasis. It looks like, you know, this kind of red and inflamed. And this is because the bleach is destroying all the cells. So in the case of ulcerative colitis, that red, painful swelling and damage to the tissue is coming from your own myeloperoxidase, and it's coming through bleach. So this enzyme is amazing at protecting us from invaders, but it also is our worst enemy when it comes to destroying our own body. And we call this collateral damage. So collateral damage occurs where the immune system basically sends in the tanks, which is what MPO is, and it fires up and it just starts to bombard and destroy everything in this area. And yes, we kill the bacteria coming through, but on the other hand, we also wipe out half of our own cells and structures behind it. And whereas before we had this little dripping tap of bacteria through a slightly leaky gut, now we have a flowing river. So you can understand that secondary inflammation is really probably the biggest difference between a healthy and unhealthy person. When the immune system doesn't know how and when to switch on and off, this is where we can get some serious damage occurring. So what happens then is the third step of the process. We start to see a cytokine storm. Cytokines are signals to go to the brain and say, whoa, we have some severe inflammation going on. We need to ignite the inflammatory response. We need to get the adrenals pumped up, and we need to get in this fight-flight response to this inflammation. So TNF-alpha is a big part of this signal. And if we look at the Western approach to dealing with chronic inflammatory conditions, TNF-alpha has been the area where they've intervened. So anti-TNF-alpha drugs work to block the signal to the brain. Humira, for example, is the most one of the most grossing drugs on the market out there at the moment in terms of money, because when we look at all of these inflammatory conditions, this is really what's plaguing us at the moment, is all of these chronic inflammatory disorders. So Western health has basically said, well, we can intervene by blocking the signal to the brain. And of course, this can help in some instances, but it's not really solving the underlying problems. And TNF-alpha blockers themselves are very, very severe side effects as drugs. So they're not easily used. So when the signal gets to the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the adrenals, they fire up, they send chemical signals to each other, and they try and respond to this by basically producing higher levels of cortisol, higher levels of catecholamines and stress molecules that can try and help the body adapt. Now, this is great as an initial and acute response, but over time, this system gets tired rapidly. And as we see it fading, we start to see inflammation levels rising. And really, the brain is not responding well to the stress. And we call this HPA dysregulation. So an inability to adapt the body and the central nervous system to the chemical, physical, and emotional stresses. So someone said, what does HPA dysregulation look like? I would say it's bipolarity, generally. Bipolarity of physiology. So we see often autoimmunity happening, the immune system just firing up and not switching off when it should. But on the other side of the coin, we see this weakened immunity occurring. We see exhaustion and fatigue, insomnia, difficulty falling asleep, struggling to wake up. And this is because our cortisol levels are not well regulated. Our melatonin production is not effective, and we're not getting proper sleep through a proper circadian cycle and rhythm. So people become dependent often on substances. We feel very foggy, we feel dizzy. In women, you can see HPA dysregulation through your hormonal cycle. So severe PMS, irregular periods, and hormonal imbalances like that. Also, you get an increased craving for sugar and salt because the body is tired and it's saying, I need energy. We feel weight fluctuations, anxiety or depression or bipolarity, irritability, frustration, tight muscles, short temper, and women often their hair will thin and lose, and in men your libido will go. So all of these things tell us that our hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals are not functioning as they should. And this is a really big issue. So I'm going to skip through the quiz. The quiz we did when we were doing our live workshops, but you may want to ask yourself some of these questions. What are two clinical differences between people with chronic fatigue and those without? So I would say from the information that we've gone through, we're seeing increased gut permeability, we're seeing increased levels of inflammation, we're seeing dysbiosis, we're seeing HPA dysregulation. There's just a few, but there's a whole lot more I'm sure now you can think of. And then name some things that can spark the inflammatory process. Pathogenic diseases, inflammatory foods, sugar, toxins, stress, insomnia, all of those types of things. And then myeloperoxidase, we call it the green snot enzyme. I didn't explain that before, but it's the same enzyme that causes the mucus in your nose to go green. So that's one of the things that we used to call it. Produces a chemical which makes this process a whole lot worse. And the answer to that one is hypochlorite or bleach. So now that we've talked all about chronic fatigue, I hope you have a really good understanding of the mechanisms behind it. And through this understanding, we can start to make sense now of why some things work well for some people when it comes to recovery. For me, my recovery began, I suppose, about 18 months to 2 years after I really became ill. And as a scientist, it was really hard for me to look outside of Western health. But I basically got to the point where I just said, I have to do something. And my first venture into alternative therapy was actually to see an acupuncturist. And I remember going to this acupuncturist very skeptical, but open because I had no other choice. And I remember, you know, they did the diagnosis, and I talked about chronic fatigue, and they said, no, we will look at your body and assess you. So they already sort of eliminated the label, which was a good start, I think, for me. But the reason I really liked or resonated with traditional Chinese medicine is because they incorporated aspects of everything. So they looked, for example, at my mental state, my emotions, my feelings, and also my physical state, assessing all my symptoms, you know, even down to my bowel movements, my sleep. All of this was incorporated into this diagnosis and this model. And I started with treatment, and it was horrifically painful, and I really didn't enjoy it to begin with. But I persevered, and I went, you know, twice a week for a good 4 weeks. And I remember there was a day, it was probably about 5 weeks after I'd started my acupuncture. And on this one given day, I managed to get through to dinner time. And when I got to dinner time, I realized I hadn't napped that day. So, you know what, I didn't nap today. And I'd always taken at least 1 or 2 naps to get through the day. And I started thinking about it. I thought, what have I done differently? And there was really nothing else except, you know, having gone to an acupuncturist. So I came back to the acupuncturist and I said, look, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but I had a good day yesterday. I hadn't had a good day for so long, I couldn't even remember. And they did my pulse, and they said, yeah, your pulse feels a little bit stronger. And so I started to get really encouraged because I thought maybe, you know, this is helping. And I said, what else can you teach me? And the acupuncturist said, well, you know, we need to look at what you're eating, because I had what they called spleen qi deficiency, spleen qi dampness. I also had a bit of liver qi stagnation. I had kidney yang deficiency. I was yin deficient. So they'd looked at all these aspects of my constitution, and they said, you need to eat for this type. And so they gave me a dietary plan. And what's really interesting is when I look back now, that dietary plan, you know, it was really all about consuming warming, gut healing foods, anti-inflammatory foods, getting rid of all of those initiators. And then beyond that, I said, what else can I do? And he said, well, you have to start practicing Qigong. And Qigong is similar to Tai Chi, but it's very, very mild. And it's basically an integration of breath work with meditative practice and gentle movement, or in some cases, no movement at all. And Qigong is an energy art in which, you know, we're trying to harmonize the rhythm of the body through breath, through movement, and through mind work. And it was really interesting for me because the more I started to learn and develop Qigong, the more I really started to feel my body and feel my stressors and understand my body. So this for me was the beginning of a really interesting journey into alternative health. And obviously, as I followed these approaches, like, yes, my health did start to slowly turn a corner. And little things started to slowly improve. And, you know, it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back often, where many times I would plateau and many times I would hit a wall. But it was the beginning of the change for me. And I'm going to talk you through more of that journey as we go through. So when I look at recovery and understand, you know, I love this quote by Hippocrates, foolish the doctor who despises the knowledge acquired by the ancients. Now, chronic fatigue is a modern day condition. And there's reasons for that when we understand the mechanisms of that. And I think we need to avoid the arrogance of saying, look, Western health knows all. And we need to look at alternative methods to help people. And I can honestly say everybody I've met, including myself in my life, who is fully recovered from chronic fatigue, has not done it solely through Western medicine. Now, that's not saying we can't integrate West into the East, but I'm just saying that we need to be aware that, you know, there are big limitations on the model. So this is my 8-step treatment plan. This is what you need to do to get your life back on track. And the first part of this is going back to where it all began and going to the gut and starting with nutritional therapy. Beyond that, we need to start incorporating pre and probiotic use into our diet and really working on the microbiome. There's a huge amount of lifestyle adjustments that need to happen. We need to then move to the liver and look at things like glutathione and what's going on with our natural detox systems. We need to go to the central nervous system of the brain and how we regulate the HPA. And then we need to focus on mindfulness practice and reprogramming our subconscious mind to keep us in that healthy state. So in a nutshell, nutritional therapy is really about avoiding anything inflammatory. So those pro-inflammatory initiators that we talked about previously have to go. Anything refined, sugar, coffee, gluten, dairy, alcohol, out of the diet. And this is really important because these types of things are just propagating the inflammatory cascade. I would say limit your meat intake, limit your salt intake and your carbohydrate intake, and really focus on good quality cuts, organic meats. With carbohydrates, I would say get a low GI guidebook and focus on low glycemic index carbohydrates. So low GI are ones that don't peak your sugars, but have slow release of carbohydrate over time. But really limiting those because carbohydrates can be quite highly inflammatory. And we don't want to overpressure those systems that are producing our ATP by putting high GI carb in our body. Also beyond that, once we've started on that approach and we've done that for 6 to 12 weeks, we can then start to look at food intolerances. And we can look for things like SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, where we're getting issues with the wrong bacteria coming into the small intestine from the bowel. And you'll see this when we have issues with ferments, issues with eating foods high in in prebiotics like garlic and onion, etc. So here's an example of my diet and what it's become. It's really about whole foods. It's when we go into the supermarket, avoiding all the aisles in the middle, because that's all our processed food, and going around the outside of the supermarket. This is where our whole food exists. Lots of green leafy vegetables, preparing our own food. And I know that when you have chronic fatigue, you have limited energy, but I would say 80% of your energy needs to go into buying and preparing your own food, because that in return will fuel your recovery. A really good book you may want to read is this one, Gut and Psychology Syndrome by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride. Now, this talks about healing leaky gut and some amazing scientific studies and results that they've shown that we can achieve just through changing our diet and healing those gut issues. So when it comes to nutritional therapy, these are the foods we need to incorporate. On our website, we have a food guide that you can download, and it's got a list of all the foods that tick the boxes. And I'm going to show you more of some examples of this coming up. So nutritional therapy is a place to start. And this is not a short-term change. This is a permanent change that we really need to make to our lifestyle. And that doesn't mean you can't ever eat a pizza again. I can now go to a pizza shop and eat the dirtiest, cheesiest, most processed pizza full of gluten ever, and I don't have any health issues as a result. But it means that we have to spend time to rebuild our body before we get to that point where we can then treat ourselves again every now and then in moderation and not have our health suffer as a result. Pre-biotics are massively overlooked. So pre-biotics are foods rich in fructans, inulins, galactans, pectin, beta-glucans. You're probably saying, what are these molecules? Well, they are not your food. They are food for your bacteria. Your bacteria doesn't like to eat what you eat. It has its own food, and these types of molecules they love. So where do we get these kind of prebiotics? We get them in things like linseed, unripe bananas, green banana flour, inulin powder you can buy, garlic, raw asparagus, raw onion, dandelion leaf, raw leek, chicory root. Amazing sources of prebiotics. And I've got some more coming up that I'll show you. So these types of things we need to look at incorporating daily into our body. And this is basically, think of it like laying down the fertilizer so that the lawn will grow. and the lawn being our biome and our healthy bacteria. Beyond that, we can start to slowly incorporate probiotics into this treatment plan. So probiotics are fermented foods. Now, doing this too early, if we're focused, if our gut is severely leaky, it's not something that we want to do too hard too soon, because it can create too much fermentation in the gut. So focus on the gut healing, but then slowly incorporate them in. If you feel that they make you too bloated or too distended, then we need to cut back the amounts we're using or try alternative forms. Now, I mean, kombucha is great, and I'm a fan of kefir, but for me personally, I feel as though the low sugar ferments are the best. So the krauts, the kraut juices, you know, kimchi, like miso, these types of foods that are not too high in sugar. If we're going to brew our own kombucha at home, you know, it needs to be slightly vinegary, it needs to be very low sugar, and limit the amount that you have, because it can be quite high in sugar. One food I found amazing when I was traveling around South America is this food called tocos, which is fermented potato. But all cultures have their own ferments that they've used for centuries for preserving food and also for helping support a healthy gut. A product that I highly recommend as well looking up is Immunity Fuel, which is a whole food fermented probiotic, prebiotic powder that you can also get in capsules that can help support you. And we sell those in our chronic fatigue packs as well. So these types of foods I want you to start incorporating as well daily. And I've got an example of this on the next page. So each day, pick one from each list. So when we wake up in the morning, that day we have to have a prebiotic fiber. And it could be as simple as a bit of, you know, a bit of onion in our salad. It could be psyllium husk. It could be flax seed that we sprinkle on our granola in the morning. It could be a chicory root tea. It could be a capsule of inulin powder. You know, a tablespoon of raw cacao, fermented raw cacao nibs, and then add in a probiotic source. So I've got gut shots that I use, which are basically kimchi and sauerkraut juice. A bit of apple cider vinegar never goes astray. Having some sauerkraut on my salad or on my food. Having some kefir water. Or coconut kefir is delicious as well. You know, a little bit of kombucha, and then also I take my Immunity Fuel on days as well, and then adding in digestive enzymes to help break down our food more effectively. So papaya is amazing for this. If I can't get fresh papaya or pawpaw, you can get frozen. If you can't get frozen, you can get dried, and just chewing on some papaya to get those digestive enzymes. Kefir also has this ginger. Always put ginger in all your foods. Pineapple skin is a great source of digestive enzymes. So is honey. But again, limit the amount of honey just because of the sugar levels. And all of these different types of fruits and foods, like kiwi fruit is a great source as well. And then what are we doing to heal our gut? So on an average day, I always ensure that I'm getting, you know, adequate amounts of collagen, and I get that through bone broth. So I do all my own bone brothing. Aloe is an amazing gut healing agent. So we get fresh aloe, we slice it up, and we put that in our teas. You have to soak your aloe before you put it in your tea. So make sure you're soaking your aloe. There's good YouTube videos on how to prepare aloe. Slippery elm cleansers, licorice root, marshmallow root, lots of turmeric, these types of things. And I've got more examples of these at the end. So on any given day, I have one of each of these. And this is basically about supporting my enteric nervous system, making my biome happy. And if we consistently do this and you're not putting inflammatory foods back in, you will notice your health drastically improve over the space of 6 to 12 weeks and beyond. Here's a really interesting discussion point. Fecal transplants, FMT, fecal microbiome transplantation. So it doesn't sound very attractive, but this is really interesting. The researchers at the Centre of Digestive Diseases in Sydney have been working on this technique, FMT, for the last 25 years. And basically what it involves is taking a fecal sample or a stool sample from a healthy volunteer and then spraying that sample in saline up into the colon of an unhealthy person with chronic inflammation, and then looking at the reduction of inflammation and results. Now, this kind of technique is very, very effective for things like ulcerative colitis. And now they're using this, and they've shown that you can treat and even reverse the effects of ulcerative colitis using this kind of technique. They did a retrospective review of 70 patients, of a group of patients that had long-standing chronic fatigue, and they showed that 70% of patients who had been treated with FMT in the CDD in Sydney had alleviation of symptoms of chronic fatigue with implantation of a healthy biome from a donor. So what's really amazing about this is then they reviewed them 15 to 20 years later, and it was still 58% of those people. So this is incredibly powerful information to show us that when we inhabit our biome with the right bacteria, we can massively reduce the effects of inflammation in the case of this study, like with chronic fatigue. So this kind of research is very, very new, and it's very exciting because it bodes the question of, how much could this technology be used and applied to all these different chronic inflammatory conditions. It's still probably a wee way away from becoming mainstream. And there's a lot of analysis of this. There was a study done with ulcerative colitis where they were using home enema kits, and they had incredible results. Over 50% of patients were drug-free remission within 6 weeks using FMT as a treatment themselves at home. So hopefully it's something that we're going to see more coming into mainstream Western health. And this is where we can bridge that gap of East and West by using these kind of techniques. But your biome is something that you need to be nourishing every day, and your biome is your friend. And we need to be looking at our biome. And how do we do that? Well, yes, we can go and do bacterial analysis of our gut, and we can map our microbiomes now. And there's a lot of companies now that are starting to develop those tools and techniques. But we can also look at our biome the way they do in traditional Chinese medicine by looking at our stools. And our stools tell us how happy our biome is. So my acupuncturist told me that we shouldn't even have to wipe after a bowel movement. We should, the same time every day, generally in the morning, before breakfast, get up, go to the bathroom. It should be no discomfort, no pain, and we should make a quick and easy bowel movement that is so consistent that it doesn't even require us wiping. And I think, when I look back at my life, there's not many days where I've been able to achieve that. So this is the pinnacle of your biome health, is measuring this. And if we're either side of this, we're too hard or we're too runny, and we have bloating, distension, we have, we're having multiple bowel movements in a day, this is your biome telling you you're not healthy. So we need to be focusing on this, and we need to be supporting it through this process. And when your stools are right, you will feel right. So really, really start to take notice of your stools, and really take notice of your gut and your biome, because it's talking to you every day. So let's talk about what you guys have learned. Name 3 foods that can heal your gut. So this is an easy one. I mean, I would say, we can say aloe vera is an amazing gut healing, bone broth and collagen, and slippery elm. 3 foods. There we go. Name 2 other things that can reduce gut inflammation. So I would say, probiotic foods, kimchi, kraut or kraut juice, and then foods like turmeric, like cinnamon, spices, herbs. So let's talk about lifestyle adjustments. Here's my top 10 tips for those who are on that recovery journey through chronic fatigue. The first tip is focus on micronutrients. So go for smaller portions of really high nutrient dense foods that have a low glycemic index and a focus on the gut healing and anti-inflammatory properties. That's really, really important. Micronutrients are really, really essential in this recovery process. So a good way to do that, number 2, is to get rid of all the tempting foods from your house. Now, when you have chronic fatigue, like I said before, you crave sugar, you crave fat, you crave salt. Your body is telling you that you want these foods because it's needing energy. But the reality is if you eat them, you will feel worse and you will exacerbate health problems. So the easiest way to not eat them, get rid of them from the house. Chocolate bars, processed foods, snacks, anything that is highly processed needs to be removed from your place, and it should only contain whole foods. Creating a mealtime routine is really important as well. If we're eating good foods, but we're eating it on the run, we're eating it moving, we're eating it without breathing, without taking a moment out, we're not digesting that food. And we're creating a lot of stress on the gut. We're creating issues with our biome, and we're putting stress back into the enteric nervous system. So when it comes to your meals, I want you to create a routine where we prepare the meal and then we take about 2 to 3 minutes to close our eyes and to focus on our breath. So I did this, and I do this using Qigong, and to do some breathing techniques from the gut to allow our body to switch off the sympathetic response and to put us into the parasympathetic state. So once we've done this, then we take a moment to give thanks for this beautiful food that we're about to receive. And then when we begin to eat, we ensure that we're chewing everything properly. Chewing is really, really important because it's breaking down the food to allow for better absorption. And if you struggle with digestion as well, then we can be incorporating digestive enzymes into this process. So the mealtime routine is almost as important as the food that we're putting into our body. And I want you guys to really focus on ensuring that every meal has this routine. You're better off as well eating less food more often. So don't put a big glycemic load on your pancreas, on your cells by having big meals. Having lots of little small meals is far more effective because it's not pressuring our metabolism. So getting a small saucer, a small plate instead of a big plate to put your meal onto is a really good trick. And having available lots of healthy snacks, and I've got examples of this at the end. Now, water is really important as well, and this is a given, but you should definitely be on 8 glasses a day. Particularly in winter, having your water in tea form is really good. So having an array of different beautiful teas that can keep you hydrated throughout the day. Exercise and separating out exercises internal and external, and I've got another slide on how to do that coming up. But exercise is integral, but not over exercising is really important as well. Vitamin D is massively essential. So I would say, you know, getting between 5 to 10 minutes minimum direct sunlight whenever possible per day. And this is going to help with your melatonin. It's going to help regulating your circadian cycles, and also boost your immune system as well and help with calcium absorption in the body. So in the middle of winter, if there's really no sun around, even you know, it's one of those balances, but there were days when I would go and just get a 5-minute sunbed when it was cloudy and overcast for days and I was feeling really down and drowsy. And obviously you need to be very careful about not exposing too much ultraviolet light to your skin, but underexposing can be just as bad. So finding that balance is really important. Number 8 is an interesting one. Assess the stresses in your life. And this is a unique one that only you can do. You know, look at your life right now. What are your stresses? What are your triggers? What are the things you can change? What are the things you can't change? What are the things you can't change easily? You know, your career, your job, your work-life balance, your lifestyle, what you do on a given day, who you're surrounded by, and then also you, yourself, and your personality. And we're going to talk about that when we talk subconscious changes. And I would say, I'm just going to have some water. I would say as well, it's really, really important to start to become mindful and take up a mindfulness practice. For me, Qigong was that. Meditation, yoga, Pilates, all of these energy arts can really help us to change the way our brain responds to the stresses in our life, and learning to breathe as well. How often do you find that when you're feeling really unwell, you stop and you listen to your breath and you're breathing from up here in the chest, as opposed to slow breathing from the belly. So learning to breathe is really an art, and this is where these energy arts can help you, because they will set your nervous system. They will put you in a parasympathetic mode, and the more that we can be in this state, the more our body can begin to heal and reset itself. So those are my top 10 lifestyle adjustment tips. Now, when it comes to exercise, I'm going to backpedal to exercise. It's like I said, if you over-exercise, we're going to create post-exertional malaise. We're going to inflame the body. We're going to pressure our metabolism. If you under-exercise and you're too sedentary, you'll also feel worse. So we need to find the balance. Now, I used to do this using traditional Chinese medicine and Qigong. And in TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, you have your liver, and your liver's job is to move the qi, move the energy throughout the body. When the liver is sedentary, stagnant for too long, we start to block. And those blockages cause muscle tension, cause pain, cause headaches, cause frustration. We feel frustrated, but it also causes fatigue. So it's a sign of hyperness, hyperactivity, but a lack of energy. And on the other side, we have our spleen, and our spleen's job is to take the food that we consume, break it down, digest it, and release the energy, the qi. Now, with the spleen, if we're over-exercising, we can be damaging the spleen. And the spleen needs, on days when the spleen energy is lower, when it's damp, it needs to be warmed and it needs to be rested. The spleen is also damaged through pensiveness and overthinking. So on one side of the coin, we have this need to move, which is the liver, need to free course. But on the other, we have the need to rest and to build our energy, the qi. And so building the qi and moving the qi are really the two things that we need to do. So on days when our liver is prominent and we're blocked and tired, we need to move, or else we'll feel worse. The liver is stagnant, we feel tired, we feel depressed, we feel pain, tension, headaches, fog, frustration, shortness of breath, muscle weakness. This is your body saying, I've got this pent up energy, I need to move. So on those days, and the more severe those symptoms, the more prominent they are, the more I would do external movement exercise. And external movement doesn't mean going for a run. It means doing some more external qigong, some more external movement, some postures, some poses that are a little bit more extensive and moving those muscles. It means maybe going for a 10 to 15-minute walk in the sun, as opposed to doing something very internal as an exercise. Doing some stretching, really, really important. These are external exercises. Now, on the days when our spleen symptoms are prominent, so we feel exhausted, we feel anxiety, palpitations, mood swings, we're craving sugar, excessive sweating, we had poor sleep, even tinnitus is a sign of this, we need to nourish our spleen. And on those days, the best thing to do is to rest, to rug up warm, drink lots of brews and broths, rest your body, and do some mindfulness practice. So for me, on those days, I would do breathing exercises, I would do meditative qigong, and I would rebuild the body. Now, I used to do this using symptoms and listening to my body. And that's what I mean about qigong, is understanding and listening. But for some people, you know, they struggle with this. And when I would get it right, I would feel better. And 80% of the time, I would listen to my body and get it right. You can also cheat a little, and you can use a new tool that they've been developing for chronic fatigue called heart rate variability. HRV measures the time between each heartbeat. And when the time is consistent, we call this a low heart rate variability. And this tells us that our body is in a sympathetic fight-flight state. So on those days, we need to rest. If we have a big variability between heart rate, we're parasympathetic. And on those days, we need to move. Now, this tool is not novel. They've been using this with advanced athletes for years to prevent burnout. And it's basically as simple as getting a heart rate monitor and downloading an app that can tell you your readiness to exercise and trying to apply that to the type of exercise you do. Now, there's more info about this on my blog, and it'd be better for you to get the link and read the articles yourselves, because it's quite in-depth discussion and understanding, and it'll tell you which apps are good and not good. So if you go to our blog on treating chronic fatigue, you'll be able to find the link to this and do a lot more reading. But we've had some amazing success with people using both the symptoms and the HRV to determine how much exercise they need to do, and also to see when they've over-exercised, because your HRV can show you that as well. So what are 3 ways that we can improve our health through lifestyle modification? Changing our diet, focusing on micronutrition, supporting our gut and our enteric nervous system through what we eat, getting vitamin D from the sun to help regulate our melatonin, to help regulate our sleep patterns. What else can we do? We could look at increasing our water intake, 8 glasses a day. It could be getting a mealtime routine and also a bedtime routine together that's going to help support and put us in the right state, in the right place before we eat or before we sleep. And then other things, assessing the stresses in our life. So let's talk supplements. Where do we go when we are looking to buy supplements for chronic fatigue? And the answer is it's very, very complicated, because there's a lot of things out there and there's a lot of claims and there's a lot of different companies producing products. If you go for everything, you're going to be spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a range of supplements that you may not need. So here's what I promote. I promote focusing acutely on the immune system when required. And I would do this between seasons, during flu season, when you're starting to feel sniffly. Really increase your levels of zinc. You can use high doses of vitamin C as well, particularly if you're trying to fight off a cold or a flu. And another plant medicine that I really found I had great success with was a herbal complex with angiographis, holy basil and echinacea in it. So I used to take this one by MediHerb, and I still take this, you know, when I'm feeling a bit sniffly or between seasons, just to reboost the immune system. So those types of supplements I would use more acutely to support the immune function when it's low. I would definitely be on a B complex or a B vitamin complex. I used to also get B12 injections periodically as well to support me through stress. But though that's going to help support your cell metabolism. Another thing you could potentially look at is, you know, CoQ10 is an enzyme. Sorry, CoQ10 is a supplement, but it's not essential, I don't think, in the overall picture of recovery. Vitamin D is really important, particularly in winter. In summer, you're probably going to get enough if you can get outside, but if not, then taking vitamin D supplements and magnesium to support anxiety, muscle, and strength. For gut health, I would focus on the dietary approach that we talked about. But if you're looking to incorporate a supplement, I swear by this one called Immunity Fuel, which is produced in New Zealand. It's made from whole foods, organic whole foods, with bacteria fermenting on those whole foods. So you're getting micronutrition, you're getting prebiotics and probiotics all in one. When it comes to inflammation, I highly recommend getting an omega oil. I love this product by Nordic Naturals, which is a fish oil, but you can also use, you know, hemp seed oil or flax oil as well as an alternative if you're vegan or vegetarian. But having those omega oils are really going to help reduce down the fat oxidation and the lipid oxidation that's occurring in the body. I'm going to talk about HPA and cannabinoids on a slide coming up, but that's really another really important area that I would focus. So that's pretty much it. Was what I use, and then also glutathione supplements, which I'm going to talk about now as well. Yeah, under anti-inflammatory, so supporting the glutathione system, which I've got separate slides on. So a lot of you may not have heard of glutathione, but glutathione is a really important cofactor, and it's produced predominantly in our liver. So we make this molecule, and this molecule works to help support our natural enzymes and detoxification pathways when we're dealing with inflammation. So yes, we get antioxidants from food, and that's why we eat a balanced whole food diet rich in antioxidants. But we also produce a range of antioxidant enzymes that are really specific. So the most important of these when it comes to chronic inflammation is the one called glutathione peroxidase, abbreviated as GPX. So glutathione peroxidase is a selenium-based enzyme, and it basically goes through your body, mops up inflammatory damage, and when it loses its activity, because it can only mop up a certain amount, it gets recycled predominantly back in the liver by glutathione. So GPX and glutathione work in tandem, and they go around your body and they support areas where you're getting inflammation. And the amazing thing about GPX is that it's really, really good for autoimmune inflammation because it's so much more potent than what we ingest from food. So here's a complex map of this system. There's 22 detoxification enzymes that utilize glutathione. The glutathione system, the thioredoxins and the peroxyredoxins all rely on having sufficient levels of glutathione. So we consume cysteine and glutamine. They go into the liver, they get made by our liver cells or hepatocytes into GSH, which is glutathione. And GSH will recycle GPX, which is the glutathione enzymes. There's about 8 subunits of those, the thioredoxins, and they will also support the peroxyredoxins. And these enzymes basically are your molecular sponges. They will go around and remove inflammation from the body and calm down those areas that are inflamed. Now, what do we see in chronic fatigue? Well, we see that we change drastically the ratio of active to inactive GSH. And this is a really, really big problem because if the glutathione is inactive, then it can't recycle those enzymes. So we need to start in the liver, we need to start to rebuild our glutathione, particularly with long-standing chronic inflammation. So there's set easy ways to do this. I mean, you take a form of cysteine, and the most common is this guy here called NAC, N-acetylcysteine. And studies have shown if you consume, 650 mg, 700 mg of this a day, your glutathione levels will regenerate over about 12 weeks. If you put glutamine in, you're going to help support that even more because that's the other building block. But glutamine as well is a gut healing agent that can help heal leaky gut. So that's why you would add it into this mixture. Lipoic acid is a source of sulfur, which is the key ingredient in cysteine, the thiol component. And then selenium in the form of selenomethionine goes into our glutathione peroxidase enzymes and also some of the peroxyredoxins. Using something like a ascorbate can help with gut absorption, and then combining it with something like milk thistle, which is going to help improve the function of the liver, and you have this amazing combination here. Now, I used to take all of these. This is why I know about all of these compounds. I used to take them in my recovery. And yes, when I was consuming all of these supplements, it definitely helped improve energy. It helped remove a bit of the brain fog that was going on. And it really supported my immune system, particularly to help fight off these colds and flus and to reduce down the flare-ups that I was getting. So, like I said before, in the case of chronic fatigue, we're lacking active glutathione and we're lacking levels of the enzymes. So by putting in this kind of combination, we're going to help really support rebuild those systems. Now, what I did post-research was I actually created an all-in-one supplement that contained all of this. And the idea behind this supplement is to not only rebuild glutathione, which a lot of other supplements can do, but it's also support the enzymes through appropriate selenium supplementation and detoxifying the liver at the same time through using herbs like milk thistle. We start to get the systems firing and functioning again. And the beautiful thing with this kind of supplement, so we call it GPX Cell Protect, is that it works over the space of sort of 6 to 12 weeks. And by the end of the 12 weeks, if your glutathione levels are firing again, you can either just really cut back to a maintenance dose, or you can even stop altogether. So it's not like it's something you have to do permanently. Glutathione, once it's built up, survives quite well until chronic stress comes back, or seasonal change, or immune issues, and then you can supplement. So you can do it on and off. It doesn't have to be permanent, or you can just start with 4 capsules a day, which is the main dose of 2 and 2. 2 with breakfast, 2 with lunch, and then later on you can cut back down after 6 to 12 weeks to 1 to 2 caps a day. So we've seen some awesome results on our website. We've got some really great testimonials. One here from Aaron, which I think was amazing, was he's tried all sorts of different supplements that have done to deal with this chronic fatigue. And he said here, it's given me an energy boost. It's enabled me to keep working and really helped massively in his life. And we've got a huge number of people that have used this supplement to improve their health and well-being now with chronic inflammatory disorders and swear by it. I'm one of those people. I mean, that's why I created it, was because I didn't want to take 6 different supplements. I wanted them all in one. But it's something that you can definitely think about using, if you're dealing with chronic fatigue or any of these chronic inflammatory conditions. Also with immune dysfunction, even things like hay fever here, where we've seen customers have massive improvements within 6 to 12 weeks. So glutathione helps our body recover by enabling the enzymes to better recycle themselves. And the enzymes that we produce are specific to protect us from primary and secondary inflammation. 3 other supplements that we can use. We can use omega oils from fish oil, for example. We could use vitamin B and B complex vitamins. We could take vitamin D and supplement. We can take magnesium. You can use high-dose vitamin C, angiographis when we're feeling sniffly. What else have we got on there? CoQ10 would be another one. All of those supplements can potentially help benefit this condition. So let's talk about our brain, our hypothalamus, our pituitary, and our adrenals. How is our brain responding to stress? And how can we improve the way our brain responds to stress and reduce down that inflammation? And the answer to this is it's complicated, and there's a lot of things that we can do. But I've summarized for you the ones that worked best for me. So number one thing that I found was that acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine were a great start to helping regulate my HPA axis. The second, so I used to go once or twice a week to my acupuncturist. The second was incorporating meditation into my routine, and I would do 2 to 3 times per week, 30 to 60 minutes worth. The third one was starting on cannabinoid therapy, and I'm going to talk about cannabinoids and where they fit, and there's a whole another webinar on this that you guys can watch, all about the role of the endocannabinoid system and regulating our HPA. The fourth was to practice Qigong, which is the Chinese energy art, about moving Qi and harmonizing the mind, the body, and the breath. I used to do that 2 to 3 times a week. And then finally, I started with neuro-linguistic programming, and I would go once or twice a month to my NLP practitioner. So that was my approach and my map towards regulating my HPA. And I found that over time, it was really highly effective at getting the brain and the endocrine system to respond more effectively to the stresses and removing those bipolarities, those highs and lows, to build some resilience into my stress systems, so that when I did go through times of chemical, physical, or emotional stress, my body was far more resilient and I could handle a lot more than I'd ever been able to before. So I want to talk through one plant that I'm really passionate about, which was a big part of my journey, and it's this guy here called Maca. So Maca is a medicinal root vegetable from the Andes of Peru. They've used Maca in Peru for centuries, and they call the food of the brain, and they use it to help build resilience and provide strength towards stress. And they say that she is a feminine plant. She holds this incredible power of resilience to stress, because she grows only around 4,000 meters above sea level in these extreme environments and climates in Peru, only in Peru, in the mountains of Peru. And so they saw this sacred radish. It's like a radish, basically, but a sacred root vegetable that thrives in this environment. And then they would sun dry it and boil it and consume it in brews. And they did that to keep themselves strong and resilient to stress. So it's an amazing stress tonic. Now, what we know about Maca is we research Maca here with Victoria University in Wellington. We have a Maca research program, is that the key behind its activity are a series of novel bioactives called macamides. And the macamides that grow in maca are actually plant cannabinoids. They work indirectly on the human cannabinoid system. Now, there's a whole webinar on this that I want you guys to watch if you really want to learn. But the endocannabinoid system is a system in our body that's really integral to regulating the way our nervous system responds to stressors. We have a really important molecule called anandamide. And anandamide's job is to basically feed back how the nervous system is responding and to finally tune every cell, every system that contains the cannabinoid receptor, which is predominantly most of our body. Anandamide is a chemical messenger that enables us to better adapt our nervous system and the way our nervous system is responding to our environment. And if we look at the structure of a macamide here and anandamide, you can see that they're almost identical. So this plant helped me a lot on my recovery. And the reason for that is because it works in the endocannabinoid system and it works to help enhance the activity of our own anandamide. So what we know with anandamide is it's produced in response to the nervous system creating and using neurotransmitters like serotonin. And it comes back to the neurons that produce and that use neurotransmitters, and it tells them how to adjust the production and how to adjust the message. So it's a chemical signal. It's like a thermostat, and it allows that original source of neurotransmitters or that source of hormone or that source of message to better tune its response so that the body is more resilient to external changes in the environment. Now, anandamide is really integral, and it plays that role as a chemical messenger and signal. When we have high levels of anandamide, we feel very calm, we feel blissful. The word itself means bliss. It comes from Sanskrit. So we feel very blissful, very hedonic. We feel like de-stressed almost. It's very parasympathetic on the body, meaning it switches off the stress systems and it regulates the hypothalamus and pituitary. So high levels of anandamide are important to help us to better regulate the way we respond to stress. And it creates this beautiful yin and yang harmony between anandamide and serotonin. And once we start to get better harmony within the nervous system, then the central nervous system is going to send more appropriate messaging out to the body. The way Maca works and the way indirect cannabinoid, so it's an indirect cannabinoid, is not through binding the cannabinoid receptors, but it's through protecting the anandamide. So molecules that do this, macamides from maca, cannabidiol from cannabis sativa, acetylethanol amines from plants like Theobroma cacao. There are certain terpenes that can play this role as well that we can extract from cannabis that are involved in that process. But macamides specifically inhibit and prevent the rapid breakdown of anandamide through these pathways, particularly through blocking one of the key enzymes. And this allows our anandamide levels to stay higher for longer, and it allows the body to better adapt to the external environment. So when we're looking at maca, we're seeing it as a cannabinoid regulator. And through regulating our cannabinoid, we better regulate the HPA. This is how it works. And it's been used for everything from thyroid dysfunction, hormonal imbalances, issues with sexual dysfunction, libido, mental health, addiction, adrenal issues, fatigue, autoimmunity, inflammation. So it can do a lot for people dealing with chronic inflammatory conditions. Now, the pros to using maca over cannabis, for example, is in some countries the legality, it's 100% legal. It's a little bit more mild and more natural. It can be used in all ages, kids, all throughout life, puberty, post-puberty. And it doesn't seem to have any effects of desensitization or dependency. So you can take it daily without any issues. Now, it's a slow accumulative process. So you're not going to get massively quick results. It's, again, 6 to 12 weeks. First and foremost, when it comes to maca, not all maca is equal, and you really have to know how to choose, use, and prepare it. So number one rule is don't eat it raw. Raw maca has never been consumed raw in Peru. And raw maca is very high risk for mold and aflatoxins. And the aflatoxins in maca will create chronic gut dysbiosis. So number one rule, don't eat it raw. What you need to look for is a gelatinized or activated or concentrated or extracted form of maca. Now, these forms have been heat treated, so you can eat them straight. If you get a raw maca, it 100% should be cooked before you consume it. And not all maca is equal. So we analyzed maca here based on their levels of macamides, and we showed that the samples we tested, only 2 out of 5 brands that we analyzed, including our own, had enough macamides to be therapeutic. And the reason for this is macamides are not made in the fresh root. It's actually how that root is processed. So once that root is out the soil, the tradition is to sun dry it for 3 months. And that process is where we create macamides. And when it becomes a rock hard pellet, they would traditionally boil that pellet or macerate it in alcohol to extract it. So what we know is that sun drying process is integral, and macamides are heat active. So cooking maca is really important. And this is why, again, you want a pre-cooked form we call activated maca or gelatinized. But also knowing the levels of macamides in your maca will determine if it's a good quality maca or not. If you're using one of these inferior quality macas, you're not going to get any results with it. So knowing the macamide levels, knowing the type of maca, and that will tell you how to consume it, but also using the right color of maca is important too. And the 3 colors are yellow, red, and black. Now, yellow is the neutral form. It's the most abundant form of maca. The same seeds give you all 3 colors, but the ratios are different. The red is the internal harmonizing form. They call the feminine or loving or nourishing form. And the black is the external masculine form, which is more uplifting and awakening. So we would say using the colors to manage the symptoms is really important as well. And if we're looking at using maca, we would say, on the days when you've got those internal symptoms like exhaustion, anxiety, palpitations, mood swings, sugar cravings, you would go, pensiveness, insomnia, you go to the concentrated red form of maca. So we do activated forms which are heat treated, but then concentrated forms which are high dose forms which give you more relief and faster acting. And then on days when you're feeling really foggy and tired, you have headaches and pain and you're feeling fatigued, then you go to the black. And the concentrated black is really good for that too. So the chronic fatigue packs that we create contain concentrated red and concentrated black maca. And the idea is you take either one or the other or both, depending on what your symptoms are. So you're really changing your treatment throughout the week, depending on how you feel. And this adaptive approach with maca gives you much better results than if you were just taking a consistent daily yellow maca. So if you want to learn more about how to manage any inflammatory conditions with maca, go to themacaexperts.com and click on the condition that you're looking to treat or manage. So we have about 15 different conditions there, and we'll tell you a good treatment plan to use. Now, the chronic fatigue packs, like I said, that we sell are probably the ideal way to start. And that comes with a concentrated red and a concentrated black jar. And that can get you going. But also on this website, we have all the information about maca, how it works, about the colors, about everything you need to know, how to take it, etc. So we've had some awesome results from customers, and these are all over our website. But specifically with chronic fatigue, where they've had really big improvements in energy, mental health, and overall well-being. So when we look at 3 ways we can regulate the HPA axis, we've got cannabinoids like maca, macamides, CBD, cannabis as well. You've got things like meditation. neuro-linguistic programming, energy arts like Qigong, for example. I'm a big fan of using things like traditional Chinese medicine, but all of these things can help with our HPA axis. So when we look at the recovery model, this is what I promote. The idea of rebuilding our Jenga tower. And the tower begins with a strong base of food, nutrition, and lifestyle. Now, this is one of the big issues that we see is like, some of these things are hard to do and people get lazy and they want simple solutions. But the reality is we need to start with a good foundation. And that's all about nutrition, whole foods, going organic, reducing sugar, looking at pre and probiotics, anti-inflammatory foods, and healing the gut. Beyond that, we need to look at ways to exercise that are not detrimental to our health and ensuring that we're getting enough but not too much. So we talked about this process before, heart rate variability and looking at symptoms and using energy arts as a restorative exercise tool. For supplements, I highly promote using different micronutrients, focusing on gut healing, regulating our immune system through the glutathione approach, using cannabinoid regulators like Maca to help support the body. And then when we look at the next level beyond that, I can't swear enough by things like Qigong and energy arts that focus on movement and breath and meditative practices. And this is really, really important to help bring that harmony back to the body and maintain it. And I'm going to talk at the end a little bit about how we reprogram the subconscious and what NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, is. So here is a generic day in recovery. This is what I want you guys to do, and this is what I did for many years throughout my recovery process. When I would wake up in the morning, I wouldn't grab my phone. The first thing I would do, keep my eyes closed, and I would focus on my gut. 3 fingers below your navel is your lower dantian, your lower energy center. And I would just start to breathe. And as I would breathe in, my stomach comes out. And as I breathe out, stomach goes in. And this process of belly breathing is really setting the nervous system for the day. It's basically, it's telling your nervous system, this is where I want to start the day, in the parasympathetic mode. Allowing the breath to determine how you start your day will change how you act throughout that day as well. If we pick up our phone and we go straight to our phone, the blue light, the radiation, the energy, we're going straight into the adrenal cortex and we're getting the body hyped up. So no phones till after breakfast. The day has to begin with breathing and mindfulness. Beyond that, I would do a cleanse, and here are 5 different cleanses. So the one cleanse you could do, for example, is a little bit of warm water, a pinch of cinnamon, a pinch of apple cider vinegar, a little bit of freshly shaved ginger, and a teeny bit of honey with lemon in warm water, and drinking it back and allowing those bile acids to start to produce. It's going to help you digest your breakfast a lot better. And this is an anti-inflammatory cleanse to waken the digestive system. On other days, we would use fresh aloe in warm water with some lemon. I'd also use a liver detox tea. Some other days I would do a slippery elm cleanse with a bit of water and some warm water. And then I also had other herbal detox and cleanses, but I would err on the side of caution to begin with those types of things because they can be quite harsh on the body. So we've done that before we started. Now with breakfast, I would alternate and I would do my porridge with some maca powder in it, with chia seeds, with pumpkin seeds, with hemp seeds. I would often use quinoa as well, swap between quinoa, oats, and buckwheat. Lots of cinnamon in the porridge, and then cook it up and either in hot water, or sometimes I'd use oat milk or almond milk, and then pour a little bit of hemp seed oil on top, sprinkling of fruit, and some nuts like almond nuts, and that was my hearty breakfast for the day. Other days I would use whole grains. Sometimes we'd use leftover rice, for example, and heat it back up with some spinach, some boiled eggs. So we got some protein and we got a little bit of low GI carb. There's an amazing bread company in my town that does whole seed ground up bread, so completely gluten-free, and it's just made from different seeds, called 7 Seeds, and that's an amazing bread to have because it's basically very low GI and it's all just nuts and seeds. So those types of foods. We'd also occasionally eat things like cassava and fry them up with a little bit of egg and some spinach. Or, you know, if the weather's a bit warmer and you're feeling warm yourself, then using, you know, your smoothie makers and things like spirulina in your smoothies, so green smoothies, spirulina, spinach, using blueberries, lots of berries and nut milks. Maca and cacao are really good in smoothies as well. Having a bit of vitamin D with the breakfast if it's the middle of winter. And then I would take my immunity fuel capsules and have some tea to go with it. So a spiced chai tea with some maca in it. So those are typical breakfasts, you know, that I would use. And also taking my glutathione supplement with breakfast. So 2 capsules in the morning. And then pre-lunch. So pre-lunch is really, that's when you've got your energy peak for the day. I always found beyond lunch energy would decline. So that's when you want to do your exercise and be a little bit more active. So I would do 20 to 30 minutes of my energy arts or 20 to 30 minutes of mindfulness practice, being meditation or breathing. And then pre-lunch, I would just before lunch, I would have my gut shot, which is my sauerkraut shot. And then I would do, you know, some steamed veggies with some poached fish, for example, or I would do some poached chicken with a salad with some quinoa, some carrots, sauerkraut, cucumber, etc. I would have like a salad with avocado, or I would do something like chickpeas and a chickpea, not couscous, chickpea quinoa salad. So those types of things where we're eating whole foods, we're getting our probiotics from our gut shots, our ferments. Also adding in things like bone broth and having bone broth in a hot drink as well is something that I would do. And I would also take my concentrated maca at this point as well, so my red and black or mix the two, or I would do that with breakfast. And then again, taking 2 more glutathione tablets with lunch. And then in the afternoon, it's time to get your sun when the sun's not too strong. So I would go out and sit outside and maybe try and get 20 to 30 minutes if possible. Bring a snack with me. I used to eat rice crackers. I still eat rice crackers and avocado, like a guacamole type mix. Some baked chickpeas sprinkled with paprika and a little bit of olive oil. Or some kale chips or seaweed chips, nuts and seeds, or make my own homemade dips. And again, if you want a little gut shot or you want some bone broth or some collagen to help your gut. And then with dinner, I was always doing and still do lots of stews and broths. Slow cookers are amazing. You know, fish head soup, lots of turmeric, vegetables, legumes, lentils, organic meats, slow cooking things, lots of seaweed and things I would put in my soups as well. And basically trying to tailor my diet to my constitution, always having lots of warming foods, rich in antioxidants, putting ginger in my soups. Bedtime routine, so I wouldn't drink water for the 2 hours before bed, and that would be to ensure I wasn't getting woken up needing to pee during the night. Definitely no TV. I used to black out my windows to ensure that it was really dark in the room, sleeping with earplugs, often using things like an app like Sleepio, which is amazing. and focusing on breathing. So not using my phone or laptop within at least 30 to 60 minutes before going to sleep, and ensuring that my body was in the right mindset in place. So that's an average day. And you know, when I followed this approach over time, that food that you are consuming and putting your energy into creating is going to fuel your recovery, and it's going to give you more energy than if we just eat out, or we're you know, we spend our time and energy doing other things. So a few highlighting sort of points that I wanted to cover before my last slide is that chronic fatigue is classified as an inflammatory disorder, and it impacts on cell metabolism and energy production. It originates in the gut and the microbiome and has dysfunction between the enteric nervous system and the central nervous system. It's an autoimmune condition as well that impacts on the HPA axis of the brain, and symptoms are very non-localized. So when we're treating chronic fatigue, we need to look at reducing levels of oxidative stress, balancing the biome, and supporting our adrenal function, which is why it's so important that we take that pyramid approach to management. Just going to have some water before I finish. So I want to hit you guys with some realities about chronic fatigue. And I'm going to talk about this in the way I learned about it through neuro-linguistic programming. So NLP is a really powerful tool. And when I was going through my recovery with chronic fatigue, I went to an NLP practitioner, and he gave me this great example or analogy of how it works. Basically, he said to me, you know, when I came in to see him, he said, don't think of a blue-colored car. Now close your eyes, and what are you thinking about? And I said to him, of course, I'm thinking of a blue-colored car. And he said to me, this is in essence how our subconscious mind works. Now the conscious mind sits up here, and this is the voice that we hear in our head, and it's in conscious control of our body. But the subconscious mind behind it actually truly controls the entire nervous system, because we don't think to breathe. We don't think to produce hormones, and we don't think to pump blood around the body or to regulate our immune cells. It happens subconsciously. And the connection between the two is the imagination. So when I hear, don't think of a blue-colored car, the image of blue-colored car comes out of the subconscious and into my imagination, and I consciously can see it. So what I want you to do using this analogy is to think about your health journey. And in essence, don't think about chronic fatigue, because what's happened through, in my case, 2 years of chronic illness and 5 years of slow recovery is that your body and your brain and your subconscious only really knows chronic fatigue, and it can't even really remember what it was like before chronic fatigue. And we can't not think of chronic fatigue because it's so embedded in our subconscious, and the image is there. So how do we overcome this? And how do we escape being pulled back in by our subconscious mind? And the answer to this is that we have to become someone else. We cannot be the person that got sick. And this is a true grim reality that I had to face, is that if we are the same person that got sick, but we're just more frustrated, more tired, more scared, more anxious, more depressed, more cynical, more worried, then we're never going to improve. We actually have to be someone else. And that someone else is healthy you. So for me, the journey of neuro-linguistic programming was about realizing that I needed to become someone different, and that the old me died with my chronic fatigue. and that the new me was going to look at life in a completely different set of eyes. So the question that I had to ask myself is, what does healthy Corin look like? Who is he? And this is the beauty of NLP, is it works not by focusing on the journey or the past so much, but by creating the future. And the future you has to be so different from the past you that you won't even recognize yourself. And I swear that when we begin on that journey, and it's a very hard journey to change the subconscious mind, but when we begin and we start to create that new you, and NLP can help you with that, but other tools can help you also, and you are your own guide. When we start to see that change and we start to get the subconscious mind to believe it, that's when we can really start to see this process rapidly increase in speed. And that's when we can start to see health coming back faster than ever before. So I want you to really ask yourself, you know, if you're struggling with chronic fatigue, am I the same person? Have I changed? Is it the same person that got sick, but now I'm just a lot more frustrated? I'm a lot scared. Have I done anything to change my subconscious? And all the people I've met who have made a full recovery have never done it through cynicism. All the people I've met, including myself, who have made a full recovery, all have the same thing in common. They see chronic fatigue as a true blessing on their life. For me, if I hadn't experienced chronic fatigue, then I would never be as happy as I am now. Because what it did was it didn't curse my life. It didn't stop my life. But it made my life change direction so drastically that it took me to a place where I can wake up every morning and take in a breath of air and feel completely and 100% content with my life. And I would never have had that before. So I need you to realize that this condition that has been put in front of you is really just a speed bump to true and utter happiness. And it's going to allow you to have a second life, a life that you're going to be so much more content with than the previous life that you would have had. And that comes through reprogramming and changing your subconscious and realizing that at the end of this, you'll become someone who will forever be content with the life that they have. So I hope that my journey is inspiring for you. And I hope that I can really encourage you to change some things in your life and to go on a different journey. Some of these images are from the last 5 years of my life. I went on a trip to Peru. I met my beautiful soon-to-be wife, Sally, over there, and we worked with this amazing community in the mountains of Peru. I hiked a mountain of 5,000 meters. I went surfing in Costa Rica for 8 hours in a day. I run my own business now with Sally, my partner, and we work with our farming community in Peru, these beautiful people from the Andes. And we inspire both people here in New Zealand and people in Peru with what you can do with the right mindset, the right heart, the right intention. And I want to inspire you guys to let you know that the sky is the limit, that your future is bright and bountiful, and that there's so much that you can achieve in your life. So I really thank you for taking the time to sit through this webinar. I know there's a huge amount of information, but I appreciate your time. And please, follow us on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook. Have a really good read through my blogs and information, and share it with people who you think may be interested. And if you want one question at the end, and this is rhetorical. What is one thing you feel that you need to change or start doing to improve your health from now on? So take that away with you. If you want to learn more, go to selenohealth.com pages in our blog, and there's some amazing articles with all the information presented here on understanding chronic fatigue and treating chronic fatigue. So thank you for your time, and appreciate it. And yeah, and hopefully we'll hear amazing stories of your recovery and your new life.